Hello everybody, in this new tutorial of Angular 8 and ASP.NET Core. So today I'll show you how to make a user grid with bootstrap table style. So let's navigate to the bootstrap website and let's copy this table style, for example. And let's paste it in manage user component HTML. So let's make some changes here. We'll define the colons. So here we have the first name colon, the last name colon, the email colon, and the last one is mobile number. So let's add another colon called actions, in which we'll put two buttons for edition and delete action. So in the TypeScript of this component, let's inject the user service dependency, and inside let's define a new property called users list, type of array of user model, and let's initialize it to a void array. So now we need to make a method called get users and the user service. So let's navigate to the user service and create a new method called get users. So it will be a get operation. So the method will be get users, and inside we'll make this .http client.get. So the return type will be user model, array of user model, and the return type of this get, it will be an observable. So this is an asynchronous operation. So let's copy this URL and let's navigate to the user controller and see we have here an action called get users. So let's change the URL and put the HTTP options. So here let's define the return type. It will be an observable of user model array. And finally, let's put the return word. So in the manage user component, let's make get user.subscribe. It's an asynchronous operation, so we define the user list when we get really the response from the web API. And now in the HTML, let's add an ngIf user list defined. So we put this condition in order to prevent error when initializing this component. And now let's make ng4. So for each user in the user list, we'll create a line. So here we define let user of user list, and let's define an index in order to enumerate the lines. So in this colon, it will be the index, and here we'll define the property of our object. So it will be user.firstname. So let's delete this and duplicate this line. So let's change this property to last name, the email, and the mobile number. So we need also to add a colon for the actions. So it will be two buttons, one for edit item and the other one it will be for delete operation. So here let's define the CSS class. It will be btn primary, and let's add the label edit and delete. Now we need to define the onClick event. It will be binded to edit item method, and let's add the same thing in the delete button. So the click event, it will be binded to delete item method. Now let's navigate to the TypeScript and define this to method. Eventually the delete item method, and I think that's all for at the moment. Let's navigate. Here we need to sign up because the managed user is protected by guard. So here we need to navigate to the navigation bar and add a new item for managed users root. So on the navigation bar component.html, let's duplicate it the home link and change the root by manage user. So let's copy this path and paste it in the root link, and let's change the label to manage users. Let's refresh, and here we have our item. When I click it, we have our user list. So let's make a margin tool here, and here we're done. Great. So now we need to create a new component for the edition. So in the next tutorial we'll see how to make this edition and a pop-up, and we will see how to make a modal pop-up for our application. So here let's duplicate the root and put a new path called edit user. So here in the edit item we need to pass the user model or the selected user. So in the HTML we need to pass the current user, and the same thing for the delete item. So when I click on the edit item, we need to navigate to the edit component. So that's why we need to inject the router dependency in the constructor. And now let's make this .router.navigate by URL, and let's put the path for this edit component. So we need to pass also the ID of our selected user. So let's define it in the root by adding /2.id. And now we need to add it in the navigation URL. So we make this, we need to pass the ID because we can prevent problems like the suppression of this user by another manager in our site web. So when we navigate to the edit component, we need to get this user. If this user doesn't exist in the database, we'll get a bad request, or why we making the edition, perhaps another one delete this user. So when we make the update, the entity framework will refuse this update operation because the resource doesn't exist in the database. So in order to get this ID from URL, we need to inject the activated root in the constructor, and we initialize in the onInit method this ID by making root.snapshot.params of ID. So now we need to make get user by ID. So we don't have this method in our service. Let's navigate to the user ID and define a new method called get user by ID. This method takes in parameter the user ID or the target user ID, and we will return an observable of user model. And let's change the return type here, and we'll see in the user controller if we have this action. Yes. So we need simply to pass the ID in the URL. So we make here $symbol, semicolon, and ID. That's cool. So the get user by ID is a synchron operation. So we need to make a subscription to this operation in order to get or to show or to initialize our selected user property when we get the response from the web API. So let's define the selected user property type of model, user model. And here in the edit user, we need to make a form like a sign up form. So the difference between this, in our case, we will not allow the modification of password and email. So let's copy this HTML of sign up component and paste it in edit user component.html. Let's make some changes here. So we'll change this sign up form to edit form. And in the TypeScript, we need to define this form group. So let's add a new property called edit form type of form group. And eventually we need to set or create a new private method called setForm in order to create and initialize our form. So here we need to define this edit form by using the form model, and we'll make the same thing like the sign up component. Let's copy this property and paste it here. So we delete the password, and also we need to initialize this form by the selected user property. So that's why we need to define this get user by ID inside the set form, and we pass the user ID like a parameter type of number, and simply we will initialize this fields by the values of the selected user. So here we have first user dot first name, selected user dot last name, and the same thing for email and mobile number. So for the email, we can't allow the modification of email because in the database it will be a unique key. So we just show it in the form by making by defining as disabled. And finally the mobile number here. That's great. So now we need to call this set form in the init method. In the same way of the sign up component, we need to define the submit method. So here let's copy the content and make the necessary changes. So here we need to copy this code. Let's paste it, and we need to make some changes here. So the set form, we need to pass the user ID, and in the onSubmit, let's change the sign up form by the edit form, and we need to add the isLoading property in order to prevent user to make many update requests by clicking much time on the update button. So that's nice. Here we need to inject the router dependency in the constructor. Type of router, so here we change router, and when we make the update we need to make a redirection to manage user page. So let's make navigation by URL. Are we done? So we need to create a new method called update user in the service. So let's add this new method called update user, and this method taken parameters the user model. Let's make this .http client. So for the update resource and the web API, we need to use the put verb. Let's see, in our user controller here, we don't have an update method. Let's add this new action. Let's stop the debug and add a new action called update user, and the return type, it will be an action result in which we can store, we can send an object or an error. So here this action takes user model like a parameter, and it will be from body. And let's add the attribute HTTP put. So for creation a new item in the database we use a post, and in order to make an update operation we use a put. And if we need to make change on a property inside an object, we can use patch. So let's add the user model and the HTTP options, and we need to change the URL to update user and make the return. Let's change the sign up form by the edit form. And here, in order to make the update operation, we need to send the ID of the entity. So here, let's add an ID inside the group, initialize it to the selected ID. Inside the user manager, let's add a new method called update user, in which we can define the business rules in order to update an entity. So here our business rule, it will be we can change the password of a user. So first of all we need to get the target user by ID from the database, and here we can check if the user exists, perhaps another one deleted. So if not exist, we can return a bad request. So we'll make simple here. In our case, we have to make affection to the user model.password, it's equal to the user from the database.password, and finally we call the user repository in order to make an update, and we pass the user model, and finally we call the unit of work in order to save changes. So here unit of work.commit, and let's define the return type. It will be void, and let's copy this method signature and put it on the user manager contract interface. So here we paste it and add a semicolon here. We're done. That's great. In the same way, we need to define a new method called delete user type of void, and it will take in parameter the user ID, so we can delete a resource by ID. And here in the manager we need to implement the interface. So let's go the user repository dot delete, and we pass the ID. Nice. And the user controller now, we need to define the content of this update user. So we need to call the user manager dot update user, and we pass the user model, and simply we return an OK action result. Let's duplicate it and change the attribute to HTTP delete, and we change the name to delete user, and simply we pass the ID of user. And let's call user manager dot delete user, and we pass the ID. We return an OK action result. That's great. So on the other side, we need to define the delete method. So let's copy this and duplicate it. Let's change the name to delete user by ID. We can delete the return type. So it will be the return type here, it will be an observable of any. And let's change the URL to delete user. And simply we need to pass the ID and the URL. And finally, we change the get by the delete. We're done. Great. Let's change this sign up form and expose this getter. It will be edit form data, and in the HTML we use this getter in order to make validation. So let's change the sign up data to edit form data by making a replace operation here. That's great. And finally we need to delete the password field. Let's make some changes here. So the button will be update, and let's change the header of this card. It will be update profile or update user. Let's navigate and see. When I click, doesn't work. I think we have a problem in the root. Let's navigate and change. We forgot to change the component here to the edit component. And yes, that's work. So here we have an empty form without initialization, because we need to define this initialization in the subscribe of get user by ID, because this is an asynchronous operation. So I think that's great here. And let's add ng if edit form defined. We show the form in order to prevent an error when initializing this component. So we forgot to put the email here. And I think for the first name we have the spelling mistakes in the web API here. We have the R before the E, so we need to change this in the user model. write it correctly. So here we change a colon in data model, so we need to make add migration. Let's call change call first name, and let's update the database. And here we go. Oh, that's cool. So now we can make our update operation here. So we have an entity framework exception. So we forgot to change, I think, yeah, the register user by the update user here. I think we are good here. Let's make an update operation. So let's change the first name, make the update. Here we go. We have another exception here. So when you make a get resources from the database, so entity framework track this entity and put it in the local context. So we need to make no track for entities, and here, yes, that's worked correctly. So here we have our update operation. So in the same way, we need to make the delete operation. So in the delete item method, we need to put delete user by ID, and simply we use user model.id .subscribe. When we make the delete operation, we need to refresh the data table. So that's why we will define this initialization of user list inside private method in order to prevent duplication of code. And here let's call it set user list, and inside we will paste this part of code, and on initialization we need to call this method. So when we subscribe to the delete operation, we need to make a refresh of the data table, and let's see what we have. Let's make a delete. So we have an error here. That's why we forgot to put the ID rule in the URL here, and we forgot also to make the commit changes when we make delete in the manager. Let's run and see. Let's make a delete. Bingo, that's work. Thank you very much. That's all for today. See you in the next tutorial.